The invitation song will be number 587. If I walk in the pathway of duty, if I work till the close of the day, I shall see the great King in his beauty when I come the last mile of the way. When I've gone the last mile of the way, I will rest at the close of the day, and I know there are joys that await me when I've gone the last mile of the way. If for Christ I proclaim the glad story, if I seek for a sheep gone astray, I am sure he will show me his glory when I've gone the last mile of the way. When I've gone the last mile of the way, I will rest at the close of the day, and I know there are joys that await me when I've gone the last mile of the way. Here the dearest of ties we must sever. Tears of sorrow are seen every day, but no sickness, no sighing forever when I've gone the last mile of the way. When I've gone the last mile of the way, I will rest at the close of the day, and I know there are joys that await me when I've gone the last mile of the way. And if here I have earnestly striven and have tried all his will to obey, will enhance all the rapture of heaven when I've gone the last mile of the way. When I've gone the last mile of the way, I will rest at the close of the day, and I know there are joys that await me when I've gone the last mile of the way. Sunday afternoon and chance of showers, but maybe they'll wait till we get through. Said a little bit chance of storms. We like the rain, but the storms and everything, I slept through them last night, and but we had a lot of little bitty limbs and broken ends of limbs off in the yard. Nothing to amount, but I think my neighbor had more damage than we did. But we'll take what we get. I don't know how many of you noticed on the PowerPoint announcements that Robert Foster's sister did pass away today in Paragould. That's where they're at, and so we need to remember them in our prayers. And if I remember correctly, her funeral will be down at Clarendon, and they had worked. Gid, her husband, had worked down there for a number of years,
as a preacher, and that's where they had his funeral. But that'll be coming up, and we'll get that information to you. Still, no arrangements yet on Dana. They're working on that today, and we'll pass that along as well. To be later in the week, probably, if everything goes as well. I really thought about the lessons. I had them picked out, or at least Sunday mornings, pretty well picked out. And I knew all of this was going on with Dana, and I knew all this was going on with Sister Walters and with the Foster family. But one of the things that when I looked at this lesson for tonight and this morning in a way, I thought we need to realize that life in this earth is just a warm up. We've got a better life waiting for us. And if anybody knew that and believed that with all of his heart and gave his life for it, was the Apostle Paul. And so we began tonight looking at our text found in 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, beginning at verse 6 and going through verse 8, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. You might wonder why I use different versions. My main go-to version to preach out of usually is the New King James. But I like other versions when they bring out the point that I want to make in the text. The ESV is one such version. Because of the fact that it says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering." Literally, that's what the Greek text seeks to imply. When he said, "The time of my departure is at hand," that's what he meant. Paul was saying that he was already, in a sense, giving his life. His own life was ebbing away. Maybe the process had started. And in light of that, he said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course, finished the race. I have kept the faith. And henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all those that love His appearing." Again, Paul is at the very close of his life. And he picks up this pen and he writes the words of the text. And really our text speaks of three things. Number one, it speaks of the present. Number two, it speaks of the past. And number three, it speaks of the prospects of the future. And tonight, as we study, that's what we want to look at in this text. Number one, we think about the present. Well, what was Paul's presence? As we already said, Paul's presence was one where he was being poured out as a drink offering. The time of his departure was at hand. In fact, the ESV said it has come. It's kind of like standing on the platform at a train station or a subway. You're waiting. You check your watch. You're waiting with everybody else. You look down the tunnel of that subway and you see the light coming. And it stops. And you know your time of departure is there. You step on and you go on. Hopefully you're on the right one. But this idea that Paul conjures up in his mind and that I see in my mind is that he knows now is the time. It's not long. It's already began. The time of his departure has come. But let's look at what Paul saw in the present day. Number one, Paul's present spoke of his dedication. His dedication. Little is said about the past, as we'll talk about a little bit of his past. He doesn't look heavily on all the things that has happened to him. He simply speaks of where he is right now in the present. And it speaks of dedication. Number one, he says he was ready for his departure. He was ready. He was ready because, number one, of his salvation when he became a Christian. We all have read the account of Paul becoming a Christian in Acts 9. Now, this man that came up with this outline that I adapted had Acts 9:6 when he saw on the road to Damascus, and he said, "Whatever you want me to do, Lord, I'll do." We know that he wasn't saved at that point. We know that he was saved when he was taught by Ananias and became a Christian, was baptized, and called on the name of the Lord. But he was saved. There was no question about that. There was no wavering about that. And as he came to the end, that was his present. He had salvation. He had lived and he served God. Not only that, he had surrendered to Christ. Whatever you want me to do, Lord, I'll do. Wherever you want me to go, I'll go. Total and complete surrender. He was ready to give his life for Christ. As we see in Acts 26:19 in another place. It's quick, complete surrender. There needs to be a time in our life, and maybe many times in our life, because sometimes we start taking it back, when we just surrender to God, surrender to His will, surrender to His will for our life, surrender ourselves to Him. Maybe we don't know what's going to happen, and yet we hear in Paul's voice, in a sense of surrender. Here I am. That was Paul's present. And then we hear about Paul's steadfastness. And nothing could make him give up. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to give up being a Christian. He wasn't going to give up because of the persecution that came his way. He wasn't going to give up. He was going to see what he started on the road to Damascus all the way to the very end. And he was willing to pay the price, even if the price meant death itself. Well, that was Paul's present. He had his salvation to depend on, made all the difference in the world. He had a surrender to God that we saw throughout his life. Again, made up all the difference in the world. And even as he was going to lose his life for the cause of Christ, Paul knew what was waiting for him. He was told what was waiting for him. He was told before he went to Jerusalem by Agabus, this is what's waiting for you. And he surrendered himself to the will of God. And Paul's attitude, I believe, well, if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. I'm going anyway. And he said, I'm willing to go not only to prison, but to death also. And then steadfastness. He would not give up. And then Paul's presence spoke of departure. He spoke of leaving. He said, the time of my departure is at hand. He knew it was going to happen. And yet he had a faith in God. It's different when a Christian faces their departure if they have faith in God. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 8, we are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. How many of us can say that tonight? And I don't think very many of us can in a way. Because again, we're so landlocked to these things of this life. And even though we might go to heaven if we die, and we know whether we'd go to heaven if not, if we die or we should, There's all this earth holding us back, and the things of this world, and the things that we want to do. And yet Paul said, we're confident, yes. And we're well pleased to be absent from this body, but to be present with the Lord. Remember what he told the Philippians? He said, look, I'm at a state betwixt two. Part of me wants to go home and be with the Lord. But he said, it's far better for me to go and to be with you. Paul's presence spoke of departure. And we know that he was fearless because he had the Lord as his shepherd. Psalms 23 and verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's what Paul's present was as he dealt with his departure, as he dealt with his salvation, as he dealt. He wasn't afraid because he knew the shepherd of the 23rd Psalm probably better than anybody else ever had. And he knew God was with him. But then we see in Paul's testimony at the end, we see his looking to the past. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7 again we read, I have fought the good fight. I fought the good fight. You see, when we look at Paul's past, it was number one, of fighting against sin. Even when he thought that he was doing the right thing, persecuting Christians, he did it with a clear conscience. He did it with valor. He did it to the best of his ability. And a lot of Christians might have been hurt because of that. And when he became a Christian, he used the same zeal to fight against sin and to preach against sin in the lives of people. And he knew sin. He knew the problem of sin. He knew Satan. Remember, Satan was the one that gave him his thorn in the flesh. He knew Satan quite well. He knew temptation. He would write again in Romans 7 and other places about the carnal nature that we have. Paul sinned. And we know that he sinned as a Christian because of the language that he used. He said, the things I want to do, I don't do. And he said, the things that I don't want to do, I do. And oh, wretched man that I am. He had a struggle, and he had a struggle sometime that he fell just like we fell. But he also wrote that there's no temptation that overtakes us such as common to man, that God hadn't provided a way of escape for. He knew there was a way of escape. He knew there was a way to say no. And so he fought against sin. He fought against Satan. He fought against temptation. And he fought against evil. He would write about the evil in people's lives. And he would point out the evil. Think when he came to the church at Corinth, he would point out nearly in the whole book, this is what's wrong with you. He would fight about the man that had his mother's wife, that they had his father's wife, that they were puffed up about. And he would chastise them and get on to them and say, deliver this man to Satan. He would write in 2 Corinthians about coming out and not being unequally yoked with the works of darkness. You can't do that. He would write in Galatians about the same thing. And he would write about the works of the flesh that some of them were participating in. Some had repented. He would work, this is what you need. In Ephesians, he would write about wearing the Christian armor, that you'd be able to stand the wiles of the devil and to fight and to stand and be saved. He talked about the victory to be won. about the Christian life is a race that if you're going to win, you've got to run it all the way to the end. That the Christian race is one that you need to lay aside every sin that easily besets you. You need to lay aside every weight. And you need to run with patience the race that is set before you, looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. He talked about the victory that was waiting for him. And as he summed up his life, and as he was talking about the past that he lived one, it was one, number one, where he had fought the good fight. Are we fighting the good fight today? And secondly, Paul said, and his testimony was this: Paul's past was one that gave him a faithful finish. It's been said by some, it doesn't matter how you start, it matters how you finish. So many people start their Christian life in such a great way, but some finish unfaithful to God, unprepared. But Paul had finished. He said, I have finished the race. Finally, he had ran it. He had ran it with patience. And so his past, again, was one, a very important thing. He knew the words of Matthew, the 24th chapter, and verse 13. But he who endures to the end, the same shall be saved. And even though probably it hadn't been written before the point he died, he would agree with John. Revelations, the 2nd chapter, and verse 10. You be faithful, even if it kills you. And that's what that verse means. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. Paul had a faithful finish. And that was what was in his past. And Paul's past was one that was of faith. No matter what Paul faced in life, he believed that God was at work in his life. You see, he's the one that wrote Romans 8 in verse 28, where through the Holy Spirit Paul penned these words, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to His purpose. There are a lot of times in life that we go through some hard things. You've been in them, I've been in them, we've all been in them. And we wonder about good. But we need to have faith. Paul had a knowledge. We know that all things work together for good. Condition, number one, to those who love God. And number two, to those who are called according to His purpose. One of the hardest things about this verse, and theologians and commentators alike wrestle with, whose good is he talking about? Is he talking about God's good? We know that everything works together for God's good. Well, if it's for God's good, isn't it for our good? It is, isn't it? Or is it our good? We know that everything works together for our good. Well, it's still God doing that, isn't it? God the Master, God the one that is working it out. And you might be at a point in your life, you can look back and you can think of the time that you wondered where God was and that things weren't working out, and yet years later you look back and you see where everything worked out exactly the way it was supposed to work out? What did God tell you? It's working out for good, for those that love God and for those that are called according to His purpose. The past in Paul's life was one of faith. And then, finally, in this lesson, you have the prospects that Paul had. We'll read the verse, but there's three prospects that are in this verse. Number one, Paul said, "There finally there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved His appearing." Note these things very carefully. Number one, there is a righteous crown that will not fade away. Remember Jesus writing on the Sermon on the Mount about laying our treasures up, not on earth, where moth or thieves or break through and destroy, where rust eats it, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Remember the words of Peter where he talks about an incorruptible crown that fadeth not away. An inheritance that's reserved for us in heaven. Folks, that's what we're living for, this crown of righteousness. And there is a crown of righteousness that will not fade away. We sometimes sing the old song, "I'll exchange this cross for a starry crown," when the gates swing outward. And then there's the righteous judge. There's corruption in judges. You hear about it a lot. You hear about judges that can be bought. Guilty men are set free. Innocent men sometimes are sent to prison. But God has given judgment to Jesus. He's our judge. He said in John the 12th chapter, in verse 48, "He that rejecteth my word have one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day." He's our judge. But Paul knew that he was the righteous judge. And we have that to look forward to. He's a righteous judge that knows us better than we know ourselves. He not only is the righteous judge, He's going to change roles in a sense. For right now, He is our one that is pleading our case to God. He's our paraclete. He's our helper. He's our intercessor, according to 1 John 2. And He's pleading our case to God. And when we stand before Him in the judgment, He's going to know us because He has pleaded our case before His Father. He's a righteous judge. And then Paul knew that he had righteous people waiting for him and waiting for us. I don't know if we're going to know one another in heaven. I kind of think by some things that are written that we might because of the Mount of Transfiguration and things of this nature. I really don't know. But I want to know this. I do know this. That there are righteous people waiting for us in heaven. They're in paradise right now, by all accounts. Sometimes we get into that discussion, where are people after they die? Are they in heaven right now, or are they in paradise right now? I guess the correct answer would be they're in paradise. They're waiting. But the thing is, they're in that paradise and they can't change. They might as well be in heaven. They're at rest. But I know that'll be righteous people waiting for us on the other side. You see, that was Paul's prospect. There'll be a righteous crown, a righteous judge, and there'll be righteous people. He would write to the church in Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 4 when they were worried because some were dying before Jesus would come back, and they were worried what's going to happen to them. And he said, don't be troubled. Rest. Don't worry about it. And he talked about the coming of the Lord, and he said, the Lord's going to come back. And when he comes back, his saints that are already there are going to come back with him. And he's going to raise those that are alive and still living. They're going to be changed in a moment and twinkling of the eye. And those that are in the grave are going to come forth. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Righteous people. And Paul knew that just on the other side of the veil that we'll all have to cross. There were those waiting for him to make it to the other side. He spoke of a departure in the present. He spoke of the past, and he spoke of the prospects of the future. At the close of our life, will we be able to make the same testimony that Paul made? If you need to come tonight, the lesson is yours. Won't you come as we stand and sing?
Savior, thou art eating, so the Savior waits for thee. Hear his words of tender pleading, hear his gracious come to me. He is calling, softly calling on thine ear. His voice is falling. He is calling, softly calling, come to me and be at rest. He has died for thy transgression. If thou wilt, thou canst be free. So he waits for thy confession. Savior, I will go to thee. He is calling, softly calling on thine ear. His voice is falling. He is calling, softly calling, come to me and be at rest. Do not linger till the morrow. Let thy loving answer be. Savior, in my joy or sorrow, I will ever go to thee. He is calling, softly calling on thine ear. His voice is falling. He is calling, softly calling, Come to me,